Transition from school to adulthood for students with disabilities. A look from both sides of the fence webinar on April 12th at 6:30 with Dr. C and Angela Murphy. Disclaimer. The ARC of Lehigh Northampton County's Advocacy Department does not employ lawyers nor provide legal advice. This training or any others provided by the Advocacy Department does not constitute or the endorsement recommendations or favorings of the program. This webinar is being shared. Okay, and with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest presenters. I have a quick bio on each. So Dr. C received his doctorate for special education from Temple University back in 1995, and for the last 25 plus years, he has been a professor for special education and a coordinator of the Rehab and Human Service Program at East Stroudsburg University. In 2010, Dr. C developed a post-secondary educational program for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities called Career Independent Living and Learning Studies, SILS, at East Stroudsburg University. Dr. C has published books and co-authored articles on supported employment, conducted trainings, seminars, and conversations of sheltered workshops to communities, integrated employment options, national supports in the workplace, behavioral supports, and in the workplace learning, lots of bios. Workplace collaborative learning as an inclusionary methods in schools, and transition from the school to adult life, what this webinar is about. The philosophy for creating environments of students and consumer choice, inclusion, the environment towards supports, services, and education has been evident in his work. Okay, now on to Angela Murphy, an attorney who has practiced only special education law for the last 25 plus years. She has graduated from Dixon School of Law. She practices with her husband, James, and daughter, Savannah, at Murphy & Murphy PC in Pen Argyl, PA. Angela represents children and their families through the state of Pennsylvania. Savannah and Angela focuses their practice on the needs of disabled students and their families in the education setting. Angela is a frequent presenter on special education issues, hoping to empower families to advocate for the needs of their children. Thank you all for your time this evening and enjoy. And Dr. C and Angela, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, thank you. So it's kind of interesting, and I thank you, Angela, for allowing me to start. And it's quite interesting that, that Angela and I are doing this together, because, and it's also interesting that, the title here is the look from both sides of the fence. It probably has been about 25 years that Angela and I were actually at opposite sides of the table when we first met. I was representing a family, and Angela was representing another family, and the school district was somewhere in between. So after that encounter is when Angela and I got together and talked about, maybe doing some work together, doing some different things with kids that needed some assistance in school. So it's always been nice to be able to work with Angela. She's very certainly a very capable and competent attorney who only has the student's best interest in mind. And I think that's one of the things that I admire about Angela the most. But thinking about this topic of transition, I think we have to understand. And again, I realize that some of you are very familiar with the topic. And so some of this is going to go relatively quick in the beginning. And then we can get into some of the more specific areas of interest. And we've already determined that if you have a question, please, ask it or raise your hand, or however you need to get our attention. We're only able to see a sliver of faces of people. So if you have a question, you may need to voice it and let us know that you want to ask. So that's
I'll rudely interrupt if I have to, because
okay.
I'll
Very
stay
good.
up here and I'll just kind of
That's
interrupt if I have
perfect.
to.
All right. So again, transition planning is the process by that has been enacted in the Individuals with Education Act, and this was done in 2004, and actually was done even prior to this, but it has been more or less re-amended and become a little bit more involved with regards to the ages in which transition begins. So the law was put into place because the idea was that schools were not really preparing students well enough for post-school life. And quite frankly, as a person who has been in the field for nearly 45 years, and a good portion of that has been in the field working directly with human services and in the rehabilitation end of things, we were seeing kids going into programs right out of school. Then after those programs got filled, suddenly there was no place else for them to go. And the federal government began to wonder why all this money is going into special education, and only to see kids going on waiting lists and not being able to move beyond the the education. They were receiving quality education, for example, but then when they reached adult age and left school, oftentimes they were on waiting lists or having to sit for some activity for them to come up, which was not certainly not acceptable, and wasn't acceptable then, and it certainly isn't acceptable now. So we know that transition has become a very critical component of a child's education. And the purpose is to facilitate that movement from school to post-school life. And I don't want to, I think it's important that we just start right away and talk about that we just don't focus on employment. And oftentimes I think many schools or many professionals think that transition is all about, getting jobs and employment. That is one aspect of transition, but it's the preparation for adult living, for community living, for being part of society and being a member of the community. So it involves much more than just gaining work experience or gaining work skills. It requires the ability to able to function in a community setting by going to stores, taking transportation to and from places, being able to live commensurate to your ability as an individual with a disability in an apartment or in some living arrangement. These are important characteristics that schools do need to address at that level, because again, as we recognized when many of these students were going into the adult service world, what was happening is that all of these skills were not available. They were not there, and schools or providers needed to then really do a lot of that training that should have been done in advance. So again, transition has been one of those things that has really become critically important. So the fundamental question, that we're going to try to pose here is how effective has our educational system been in preparing students for disabilities to meet the challenges of the future expectations for themselves, their family, society, and even the service system itself. So, we know that, and here's the part that perhaps even those who indicated that they have a good knowledge base of transition may not necessarily be fully aware of. But the data that I want to just state, go through, and I'll after I present the data, I'm going to turn it over to Angela for additional comments and things like that. But being the academician that I am, I believe I want to be able to present data to support and provide rationale behind the importance of these kinds of initiatives like transition. So the time of reflection is really about what has really been done, or how effective have we been? And I mean the schools or in our educational system in general, how effective have we been at preparing individuals for post-school living and life? So we know that, so why do we need a transition? Well, again, students with disabilities need more specific plans and strategies. It isn't like you or I, where we went to when we were in high school. At least from my perspective, I had a guidance counselor. I had a 4-year plan. In my 4-year plan that my guidance counselor presented to me was a college-bound 4-year plan, even though I probably, was not considered college-bound then. But my guidance counselor laid out a 4-year plan. These are the courses, these are the things you have to do in order to be prepared to go on to post-secondary education at a college level. So we had a plan, but we didn't do that, with kids with disabilities. Oftentimes we don't provide this plan. We kind of do these IEPs and do an annual goal or do annual planning, but we very seldom go beyond that 1 year. And what transition, of good effective transition, and we will talk about best practices, should be along a longitudinal kind of plan. It is looking down the road, 4 or 5 years down the road. If a student is 16 years of age, then we should be looking at where do we want this student to be when they're 21 years of age, and then work backwards from there. So we haven't done that, and that is one of the things that we need to incorporate. So again, the idea that students really need something specific is critically important, because that has not really happened. And if we don't consider post-school outcomes, students with disabilities will not be successful. So if we don't look at the end product, the end game, if you will, for a student, the success rate for those individuals is going to be very limited. It's not going to be very good or very successful. So we really have to focus more on that end product. It's, I attune it to people who begin to think about retirement. I'm at the age where I'm considering retirement, and so I met with a retirement professional. He says, "Well, what do you want to do? I mean, when you retire, I mean, how much do you need to live?" And you give him a dollar amount, a monthly dollar amount, and then he works backwards to see how much you have to accumulate in order to do that. Well, that's a perfect example of how transition works. You have to do the end product first and then work backwards to get to where we want to go. And what is needed is, or again, the IEP process tends to provide that rationale behind what transition is all about. Now, I'll say this again later, but I want to just mention it now. There is no transition plan. We talk about a transition plan, but there really isn't a transition plan. There's one plan, and that plan is the individual education program. That's the only plan there is. Now, within that IEP is transition planning or services. So within the IEP is a whole component or parts to preparing and planning for and creating a transition outcome for our students. And I think there's oftentimes this confusion, because when it comes down, you put the information in the section where it says transition planning, and then all of a sudden when you get to the goals and objectives, all they are academic goals and objectives, and they don't relate to the post-school outcome that is being considered for the student. And I'm not implying that those academic objectives are not important, but you have to, goals and objectives have to also include things that are going to be related to the transition outcome statement that is important. So, let's be clear here that there is no additional plan. So real quick, in terms of, there's a gap between individuals with and without disabilities, and even those with differing disabilities. The labor force statistics shows and indicates that that estimated that 28% of working age adults 16 to 64 with disabilities are employed. So that's 28 out of 100%. So that means that nearly 62%, if I'm doing my math correctly, No, is it 72? See, I'm not a mathematician. Whatever percentage, it's quite high that those are the numbers. So, that's compared to 71% of those without disabilities who are employed. So there's a huge discrepancy here. There's a huge gap in terms of employment for people with and without disabilities. And we never hear about this. We always hear what the statistics are for the general population when it comes to unemployment rate, but we never hear about the unemployment rate for people with disabilities. And I wonder even if those are included in those statistics. So, the labor force data also indicates that workers with disabilities have had significantly higher levels of job loss and hardships during the recent recession that we've had, or even during this pandemic, if you will. Now, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and I'll may refer to it as IDD, the disparity in employment participation even widens even greater. Data from the National Core Indicators project suggests that only 14.7% of working age adults supported by state individual with developmental disabilities agencies participated in any kind of integrated employment. And 27% of individuals with that same type of disability supported by their organizations worked in any kind of integrated job. Now that including both individual jobs and group types of work. So again, without belaboring the point here, there's clearly a huge gap of employment for people with disabilities. And if we were to include, and I just kind of mentioned those on the spectrum, autism spectrum disorders, because in Pennsylvania, we have the Autism Bureau and we have the Intellectual Disabilities Bureau. So we have two different bureaus to address the needs of two different populations. And then, when we think about, those with autism spectrum, 25% of youth with ASD are engaged in some form of employment. Again, the idea here is that 75% are not. So only 25%. So, but of that other 75%, post-secondary ed is about 15%, job training and other kind of activities, 13%. So we're still seeing a huge gap in terms of functional skill development that is being, being done within our schools. And yes, I am focusing on employment right now because that data is so readily and easily available. That data is clearly available through the Department of Labor, whereas other data like residential and community participation and independent living skills, all those things, it's not so clear. We just don't have that kind of data that is so solid that we can report on. The National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, that is the NLTS, National Longitudinal Study, which was done by the offices in Washington. Students with ASD are among the least likely to be actively involved with individuals with friendships. And again, this was some of the statistics that they generated. 44% never even visited with a friend. 83% never receive a phone call from a friend. And I think many parents who have children on the spectrum can see this data and can empathize with it and can understand it certainly much more than some of us who may not have or don't have students or individuals with spectrum disorders. This is, unconscionable when it comes to thinking about your own child and their participation with friends and relationships and things like that. And again, many of us in schools might think, well, why is it our responsibility? Is it our responsibility to help students find relationships and friendships and all of those kinds of things? And quite frankly, I think it is to some extent. I understand that, academics are the greatest emphasis that are available in school, but, we also, need to do something about the social emotional aspect of our student population. And we certainly can do more. And we are doing more because we know that there are many teachers and professionals who are engaged in those kinds of activities with their students. Just a few more slides with data. 45% have outcome statements of competitive employment, yet only 15% have state, but yet only a smaller percentage of those actually do get employment. I don't know what kind of outcome statements the other 55% of the students with ASD might have. It could be college, it could be, it could even be adult day programs or some kind of activity levels like that. So 15% have outcome statements that focus on sheltered work, which at this point in our of our thinking, and I hope all of you who are out there, professionals, parents, and everyone that's involved can clearly understand that the adult service world is no longer considered a viable alternative. That is, that there's very limited opportunities for individuals to go into day programs, sheltered workshops, or any of those kinds of things that are considered to be more protective. And I totally understand, and some of the studies that I've read about reasons why parents support these notions or these types of programs is because they feel that their children are much safer, that they're able to get a full day of service as compared to getting a job or being out in the community. I totally understand that because it's a safety issue. But that is, that rationale is not going to be supported very much, in coming. I mean, even today, I don't believe that it's really supported today. So we have to acknowledge the fact that adult day services and programs are being seen as very limited in terms of opportunities because of the entrance of people going into these programs. As there is just no room. Most of them are filled to capacity, and many of them are not receiving funding to fill or to increase their numbers. So, so these are things that are important for us to understand as we work within the transition end of things. 67% were not present at their planning meeting, which I think is something of a problem. That I believe very strongly that individual students and individuals should be present. Many people feel that they're too much of a stress on their kids, or that they don't understand what might be what is being said. And I totally disagree with any of that. I believe that it's very important that we should be helping students understand their role and what transition is all about and what it is that is being spoken about them. These are things that should be done at that very important juncture. 80% of parents with ID and ASD want to see their children work in the future. So we know that there's a great percentage, and maybe even more so than that. I think many of these parents probably go beyond just work. I think they want to see their kids being included in their communities. They want to see their children part of their community, living and functioning, and being just simply a member of the community, which we don't see very much of. Parents with ID and ASD are worried in terms of their children's transition process because they're not sure of what the future will hold. Parents of children with autism, reported more knowledge of adult services, which is quite interesting. So certain parents were more knowledgeable about the system that gave them the tools to be able to, to kind of fight for their children a little bit more. And parents of children with ID and ASD expect their child to move out of the family home. I mean, that is an expectation. I mean, even though the study was done in 2010, I don't believe that this study is any less of value now than it was then, because that's probably the hope for most parents, whether you have a child with or without disability. I think that is the expectation or hope that their children will eventually, move out. So what does all this data mean to us, with regards to education transition, the IEP process for students with ID and ASD and other developmental disabilities? Well, I think it clearly demonstrates and shows that we have a long ways to go. And as much as and as often as we hear, and I'm going to pass it on to Angela in a second here, as much as we hear from many districts and many professionals and schools that they're doing a great job with their children, with their students in the area of transition, we're still seeing these horrible numbers, and we're still seeing the kinds of things that have not led them to be successful in their community and in community life. So I think we have to acknowledge that this data is sufficient enough for us to be able to move in a direction and fight more and fight harder if we have to ensure that students are being better prepared and are receiving the kind of transition services that will lead them to a more successful outcome. And we'll talk about those as we go on through the night.
So how does one involve them, IDD, in transition when the school uses the meeting to either distract from or to determine initiatives and accountability to progress goals?
Angela?
And you know, that question really is the crux of my comments. I mean, what this parent, I'm assuming, correctly intuits is that the system is utterly failed. I have nothing positive to say right now, especially after this last year. So this idea for reflection is, unless you are going to, unless you are going to really do the studying, and that's what we're here for, to give you those tools, and you're going to bring that to the team, you are going to see sort of a distract and let's go to something else. Transition is often barely discussed, even in meetings that I attend, because frankly, if I'm there, there's usually some, or in many cases, there's some very, very, very pressing issue regarding behavior or academics or communication. So we're often so caught up in the yearly goals and what the program looks like that we forget to talk about transition. So, you know, I would encourage all families with students who are especially getting older to make sure that time is devoted to talking about transition. Force the issue. If you're one of those situations where they say, well, the prep period is at 7:40 to 8 o'clock and we only have 20 minutes. Well, first of all, that's not legal. And if you have to have, they have to accommodate you and they have to provide enough time. So make an agenda, make sure you talk about transition in a meaningful way. Try to avoid that distraction that you're talking about in the question. And you will have to force this. You may have to come with ideas if they're trying to distract, more concrete ideas. And so that's where Dr. C talking about the best practices becomes very useful, because otherwise, if I'm at a meeting with a parent and we're just talking about these best practices, well, what do we know? I'm just the parent lawyer and you're just the parent. What do we know? So that's where you're looking for somebody like Dr. C to come in and say, okay, but here's some ideas. Here's what we can look at. You want to have it individualized. And you know, so in general, the biggest failing of the system is there's no individualization. The law says Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IEP, is individualized education program. It's a misnomer. It's almost, if I'm going to be really cynical, it's almost a joke. Unless you force the individualization, it's not going to happen. So when you go to your child's transition meeting and they have, oh, we have this really great coffee program. Well, the coffee programs are great, but not for 5 or 6 years, right? So you might start as a freshman, but now your child's going to be 19 and you're still doing the coffee program. It needs to be individualized. You need options. You're not just talking about employment. If you have a student that could go to college or wants to go to college, well, let's look at that. If the goal is out of reach, well, how do we craft the goal that is within reach? And again, I think that's where an expert like Dr. C comes into play, to give those ideas and bring them to the team. The team is probably not going to take you just as a parent seriously enough, unfortunately. And I know we're going to go into a lot of this, but the other thing I heard Domenico say very, 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 very early on when I first met him, that transition starts in kindergarten. So, and that's one of the biggest things that the system has to look at. How do you expect a nonverbal autistic student who's been doing VB-MAP for 15 years, who has not been given access to a communication device, to all of a sudden seriously talk about transition to adulthood? So that's where, that's where the individual pieces of the IEP comes in. Have we looked at communication seriously enough? Do we need an AAC device? Do we, haven't been teaching reading to a child in autistic support. How are we going to introduce that? And so that's where the parents need to look at the entire system. So we have a system who is expecting transition to adulthood when the system has never seen the ability of the student. And that's probably one of my biggest critiques of the system, is if you're nonverbal or you don't have a high IQ, well, what can we expect out of you? And we need to see potential, whatever that potential is. And that's why I always like the topic of transition, because someone like Domenico, who does transition well, only sees the potential in the student. So that maybe is part one of the key points: individualization, forcing the discussion on transition and forcing the school to see the potential. And you may end up in a due process hearing in a situation like that. But that's, in summary, where I would see, in response to this reflection, where do we need to go? It has to be individualized. It has to look at long-term success, whatever that means. So I'll turn that back to, and again, for parents, I would really, these are going to be the things Domenico is going to go through, those best practices from that educational perspective. You want to see that. So this is a good learning process for you to go in and say, oh, well, where is this results oriented? And how are we going to make how are we going to talk about independent living skills? Or, well, wait, my daughter wants to go to college. Why are we not talking about her academics? So those are the things to key into here. And I'll turn it back to Domenico.
Just to add what Angela was saying, getting documents in advance might help. Instead of going to the meeting and reviewing all of these documents there, ask to receive them in advance and begin to look at them. So when you go to the meeting, you can quickly go through the aspects of it that they have to do, and say, you can agree or disagree with, but then you can say, okay, this is where I want to focus our attention on. And then you focus your attention on the areas that you feel are the most important. But, when you are sitting there and you're only looking at the documents for the first time, it's excruciating sometimes, because they're explaining to you or they're talking at you, and all you have to do is listen. And that's not, it's not good use of your time or theirs, quite frankly. But I think that's important to get that in advance. Another is, parents have done this, and I think Susan Klug may have, introduced this to a parent a long time ago. Maybe, I believe anyways, I'll give her credit for it. But parents start bringing their children's picture and putting it on the table. So, all of a sudden, every time the focus gets drawn into a different direction, the parent would say, this is who we're talking about. This is what we have to focus on. This is my son or my daughter, and this is what we're here for. Turning the attention back on the personal aspect of why you're there, and as Angela was saying, and try to individualize it, as much as you possibly can, so that it may make them feel a little embarrassed, but who cares? If they're gonna, circle the wagons with their professional staff, well, then you have to help them focus on why they're there to begin with. So maybe that's something. And I'll mention this other thing later on, but going in with a vision statement, an outcome statement, and handing that statement out to all the people in the table, saying, this is what the outcome should be, or this is what I want my outcome to be for my son or daughter. And then you hand that out to all the people. So now they know what it is that you expect from the process, because you've just given it to them. You've given them the outcome statement that you want them to focus on. So that also helps to draw the attention back onto the process and not on all these other distractions that might be out there. And finally, I think, and Angela mentioned it too, there's what I call a breaking point. There's a point in a student's or an individual's education where parents have to decide what direction they're planning to take. Are they going to go in the direction of secondary education, post-secondary education, college, or are they going to go in the direction of employment and community work and all of those kinds of things? You know, because at that point, that's when that breaking point is, where the specific areas of instruction come in. You know, if you want academics, well, then that's what you're going to get. But we also have to be very clear on whether our children are capable enough, or, you know, are ready for that academic rigor or not. Maybe experiencing, you know, community college initially, and then deciding that way. But again, I think there's a point where we all have to decide. I remember doing an evaluation on an 18-year-old student, and this one had a lot of emotional issues and things like that. And my recommendation was that they stop doing the reading program and start focusing more on community-based training and getting the student or the individual ready to function and live in the community with a job. He already had a certain level, a reading level, but, you know, maybe that reading level was sufficient, you know, for what I felt was needed. And the family was very much, you know, against it, that they felt that their child should be continuing to be receiving reading instruction. And I said, how many more grade levels do you think your son will achieve in the next 2 years? If it's one grade level, what difference is that going to make? You know, in terms of that, in terms of him being able to learn what's important to be able to function in the world. But some parents, you know, feel that is more important than other things. And I mean, that's the parents' call. You know, it's certainly their call, but at some point there's like I said, I call it a breaking point where that decision has to be made, because when you have a limited number of years left, those limited number of years have to be, you know, provided in the most effective and efficient way to ensure that at the end, that kid has something, you know, ready for him to go to. You know,
But I think, Domenico, you know, I would say, yeah, when you get to the end, there's a limited number of years, but this is parents on this call who may have younger children. Don't let the school make those assumptions early on. You know, you might be dismissed as, well, you don't have realistic expectations, but still there's technology, there's things out there right now that you can try other ways. But if it's not done early on, it's not going to happen later on. Like if your child's been on a pre-K level since first grade and now is in ninth grade, you know, the time to have really worked on that was earlier on. And a lot of times that doesn't happen in these autistic support classes, life skills classes. The emphasis isn't on academics. There's a presumption the child can't. I have a big problem with the presumption the child can't, especially very, very, very early on. And so this idea of enabling you, the parent, to advocate, the whole concept of transition, the way I see it, Domenico, is it's enabling your child to achieve those outcomes as a young adult. And as we all know, and Domenico already said, there is nothing out there. This dearth of services he talked about 20 years ago, well, well, there's no staff, there's no programs, there's no spots, there's no mental health, there's nothing out there. So you have to push the school to do it. You really don't, we don't have any choice right now but to push as hard as we can. And the law allows you to do it because of the word individualized. That word, which they never do, is your key word to really push back for your child. So I'll keep saying that over and over, I'm sure, because that's the theme. This individualized plan based upon age-appropriate assessments that are designed to look at education, jobs, life skills, and independent living. That's what's supposed to be happening, and it doesn't. And you will need to make it happen by forcing them to do what they're supposed to do anyway. So I didn't mean to.
Well, this slide here it gives you all that information. I mean, what is it, what is it supposed to do? Post-secondary education, vocational training, integrated employment, adult education, adult services, individual independent living, community. That the process includes all of that. There's one key and one operative word here that was changed from the previous transition definition out of from the education law, and that is it is changed to results oriented outcome. I believe it said something result oriented process, and I believe it said an outcome oriented process. And the word outcome seemed to be confusing, and then never really led to the actual result of what the expectations were. So they changed the definition, and they put in results oriented outcome because they're asking for results, or at least the definition of transition or the federal government is asking for some results, something to actually happen. And these are the components, again, key words here that will be bringing up along the way here are coordinated activities, and that includes all the different players, because I do see that there was a question that that Cody sent us about, what else can we do other than, OVR, for example. But those are the coordinated activities. Those are the those linkages that are outside the school system that can be tapped into. And we realize that educators may not know all of those linkages and all of those kinds of things, and that's where maybe families have to be a little bit more in tune with the adult service world, prior to their child graduating from school. Individual students' needs. Again, we're focusing on the individual and what their needs are, and it's based on the students' preferences and interests. And this is relatively new, and I say relatively new because I've been doing transition for so long that I remember that as long as you got a kid something outside of school, as long as you got them either a job or you got them in a program, well, you did what you were supposed to do. But it didn't matter whether whether it met the student's interest or not, and now we have to pay attention to that, because we know that interests and preferences motivate kids. If we want them to be motivated to want to do something, let's do it in areas that they're interested in participating in. So it's important that we recognize that this language was put in there for a real important reason, and those are just a few of the reasons why it was in there. But again, these are the areas, post-secondary education, employment, independent living, and if it's appropriate, daily living skills and functional vocational eval. These are all things that are in the transition area of the IEP that should be a focus, that that need to be addressed. What we're seeing, and Angela can say more about this, is that they're not all being addressed. They're just mildly, skimming some discussion or having some discussion about, but they're literally not being addressed in a result-oriented way, that they're preparing kids for that outcome. So those are some things that I concerned with. Angela, I don't.
Just want to add one thing. And when you had the slide about the friends, of course, that's a big worry as a mother of an adult with autism. That's a perennial worry, even when they're not living with you. So this that social piece is inherent in employment, in independent living, in post-secondary. A lot of verbal autistics, their key issue is social skills. You know, they may be the most qualified person. I read a story once of, you know, an autistic adult who had 3 degrees, but couldn't find a job because he had no social skills. So absolutely social skills, that community interaction, that's part of this transition to adulthood, because without it, even the brightest person on the planet, unless they're a billionaire like Elon Musk, is not going to be able to find a job. So I just wanted to add that. And just one other point about students' preferences and interests. That's where the assessments come in. So what kind of assessments are they using? Did they actually use an assessment? Was it done in a way that the child could actually communicate his or her wants and needs? Communication is a big issue with the autistic and ID population. So that's part of it. And we shouldn't be assuming that just because someone's not verbal or doesn't use words to communicate, that they can't communicate their likes and their preferences. And so those are just 2 points on the slide.
Yeah, and just to add to that is that when we think about these assessments and interests and preferences, you know, something that I've been advocating for, and maybe some of you, I know Cody and the ARC staff clearly know all this, that person-centered planning is a process that can help flesh out some of this. And it doesn't require a paper and pencil, doesn't require an aptitude test of sorts or interest. It is really a way for us to gather information from the people that know the individual the best, and have the individual participate. And even if they're not able to communicate, you know, eloquently or verbally well enough, there's a level of communication that can be obtained that will lead us to understanding what their interests and preferences might be. You know, and again, by looking at their history, their background, their what they enjoy doing, where they go. I mean, all of these things that takes time, but, you know, it's not something that is easily obtainable. But if we really want to be successful, we need to take time in gathering this information so we can put this into practice when we really want to prepare this individual for post-school life. Those are, you know, so those are some, you know, things that I think are critical. You know, to summarize, you know, what is best practice when, you know, and when we think of best practices in transition, what does that mean and what does it include? It means good planning, good preparation, and good implementation. So we're going to review these things, you know, individually. But you know, the planning is what we've really been talking about. You know, how do we know what a student wants to do, or what is, you know, what is the post-school outcome? And, you know, I mean, I don't know about you. I mean, you know, thinking back about myself personally, you know, I didn't know that I was going to get into this field until, you know, my 4th year in college. You know, I mean, I got into the education field and things like that, but I really did not know until one of my professors, who I admired greatly, he was, you know, someone who went and worked with Mark Gold and Associates, who I have learned over the years to admire greatly for his work, because he was one of the very first people to demonstrate that individuals with severe and significant disabilities could learn. And that's when I turned myself around and said, oh, it's more than just sorting chips and putting, you know, things in bags. They can do complex things. And now I have the technology to help me to do that, meaning I have the strategies that help me to do that. So, when we ask kids at age 14 to give us a post-school outcome, what do you want to do when you grow up? Or even when they're 16, what do you want to do when you get out of school? It's like, we don't even know sometimes. Our kids don't know. So when we think about the planning process, it's really, really difficult, to figure out what does this individual want to do when they leave school? Where do they want to be? So that planning process can be very, very difficult. But I believe that if we spend the time and really explore and work with individual students in planning, the rest comes in relatively easy. We will have a good preparation and a good implementation because we already know where we're headed. But I think that's the part that's really difficult for us.
But I think that the planning piece is what the IEP is about on a yearly basis, because fundamentally, again, social skills and communication are two of the most fundamental, vital. Unfortunately, society has decided that we are a verbal society, and if we can't communicate verbally for whatever reason, we might even be very anxious. We might be an anxiety-riddled person, and we can't communicate. Those are things that can be worked on every year, and with increasing the communication, the child may be able to tell us what they're doing. If the child is melting down during when they're going to the coffee session, well, behavior is probably telling us, maybe we should look at something different, or maybe we need to work on behavior. And I do think that's one thing that's missed. I've had more and more parents say to me about behaviors in the more restrictive classrooms that I think he's bored. I think he's bored. I think he's done this long enough. And and this is just the past couple of years. I can't tell you how many parents have said that. And I thought, wow, if you've done the same thing in the same classroom, in the same way for your entire educational career, you probably are bored. So what is the child telling us by what they are interested in, and where the behaviors are less and where the behaviors are more? So I would, Domenico, suggest that you look at the IEP as the planning and the preparation. And if the child can't tell us, look at behaviors and communication, and build from there.
No, that's an excellent point. You're absolutely right. I think I know when I discuss, or when I teach applied behavior analysis, one of the things that I point out is that sometimes behaviors do not seem to have a function or purpose. And we're sitting there trying to figure out what that purpose is, when it might be simply that, the kid may be just bored and he's just entertaining themselves, so they're acting or doing something as almost a self-regulatory way because they're bored, and we haven't even picked up on that. We don't know that they're bored, and we're assuming that there's a behavior problem, and that's when we create all kinds of ridiculous things to go there. But I agree. I think you're really very much on target with that.
Well, the best thing, and another example is the best thing the first piece of advice when my son was very little that someone told me when I was thinking he was being bad, was that his behavior is communication. He doesn't have the words to tell you. So that was like the light bulb went off. All of a sudden, everything he did was different because he was telling me, not with his words, but unfortunately not always with the best behavior, but that's their communication. And I do think it takes time. I think, Domenico, you were 100% correct. It takes time and attention. And when a teacher is understaffed and overcrowded classroom, the best teacher in the world doesn't have the capacity to give the time and attention that it takes, I think. And that's one of the themes that we're seeing right now, is with the lack of staffing. It's chaotic in these classrooms, and it's very unfortunate.
Well, again, going back to, what do we think of best practices? Well, planning and preparation is one of the practices for transition. But when we think about planning, we have to create a vision for post-school life. That is, the plan does not work unless we have an outcome. So families, this is where families need to really be diligent with and working with their son or daughter to create this vision statement, this post-school outcome statement. And, to me, this is simple. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to repeat this in, reports or evaluations that I've done, or, with families. That is one of the most important things to create, is this vision statement. So we know where we're going. It's sort of like getting in your car and you're driving somewhere, but you're not sure where you're going. So you're driving around in circles, you're spinning your wheels. You have to have a destination. Now, I mean, not that, transition, and we'll say this later on, it's not a destination, it's a process, but at least you know where you're headed, and that's really important to understand. So families and professionals, teachers who work with kids in transition, think about this. And if you're a family member, you need to create a vision statement. If you're a teacher, encourage families to do that, and even work with them and help them do that. So advocates, those are the things that are important. And then, of course, the preparation, once you've got a vision statement, you know where you're headed. So you're either going to be going to college, or maybe you're going to work, in which case, the preparation process is different. You're either going in one direction or another. And that becomes very important. And, let me just simply say that, more and more kids with intellectual disabilities are going on to college, even if it is like my SILS program, the Career Independent Living and Learning Studies program. I mean, we're seeing more and more of these kinds of situations. And we're also seeing some kids going into matriculated programs after experiencing, those non-matriculated programs, after they've gotten the comfort level and gotten really used to the college experience and the environment. So, I mean, these are things that, that work. I mean, again, this is a process. And in that preparation, what's critically important for me, in my mind, is that individuals learn self-advocacy and self-determination. And that's the process by which they get and to understand what they want, and be able to, actually to be able to vocalize it or express it, or just, be adamant about what they want out of life. They're self-advocating, they're speaking up for themselves, and they're, they know what they're, they know what to say in light of the rules, that, they're abiding by. The Americans with Disability Act has been around since 1990. And though there are so many, great, rules that are related to the Americans with Disability Act. But if an individual doesn't understand what those rules are, then they can't apply them. They can't use them. They can't use it to their benefit. So minimally, they need to really understand what their rights are, and also how to speak up for themselves, and how to make decisions and choices, even if they're not the best choice that they're making, at least they're moving in that direction. So I think those are important things as part of the preparation.
And for parents, until your children can do that, this is what programs like this is all about, to allow you to advocate for your child, and you to use that self-determination and get the tools that you need so that you can push back with the school district.
Okay, so I'm just looking at my next slide here, what that might be. Oh, okay. So let's take a look at the differences, and this is really going to be quick. High school, all students have the right to an education. In college, they only have, it's college is a privilege. Individuals with Education Act and 504 and ADA are consistently used in high school or in public schools. Only Section 504 and Rehab Act, which means that they're only going to get accommodations no modified curriculum, no modified program. So again, it's important to understand the differences. School districts are responsible to identify the disability in schools. The student is responsible for providing documentation for verification of their disability if they're going on to college. So again, that's a huge difference. In the public schools, the school district designs the IEP. Well, in college, the student identifies his or her own needs in collaboration with perhaps a disability, services counselor or someone from that office. But, there is no required person that's assigned to ensure that they're going to, work, that they're going to design some plan of study for them. In high school, teachers function as an advocate. In college, the student has to be their own advocate. High school, fundamental alterations to the program of study are made, modifications. In college, no alterations are made and are not allowed. Only accommodations, which are significantly different. And we're not going to get into the differences between them. Personal services are provided, like, an aid to, aid in the success. Well, there are no personal services. And the students are responsible for their own if there is a personal aid that is there, but they do provide tutoring and various other things like that. So again, understanding the differences is very important. Transportation is provided. No transportation in college. In high school, parent guardian is the primary advocate. And in college, the student has to be or should be the primary advocate. So sometimes it's important to note the differences that exist between the two. And, we could do the same thing for adult services, and basically in school, public education, everything is an entitlement. You are entitled to a free and appropriate public education. And adult services, there are no entitlements. They're only, you're eligible. You can be deemed eligible for services. And even if you are deemed eligible, if the funding isn't there to provide that service, well, then you're put on a waiting list waiting for those services. So it really, forces us to be a little bit, much more proactive with regards to the preparation process and transition for students, because we don't want them sitting around at home. We don't want them waiting for services, because we know what happens when people sit around too long. I mean, we did that in the pandemic, and we're reaping some real tough issues right now with the emotional stress that it put on so many people and kids and students. And now we're really looking at the stress levels that our students endured during the pandemic, and we're seeing it now. And those are the things that happens when we essentially place people in situations where they're seen as in kind of in a lonely position, and that's really not what we want to see.
Domenico, I just want to two quick comments on this slide. I might have said, say college and or workplace, because you can have 504 accommodations in your workplace. But again, your employer is not going to fundamentally alter your job. There might be, if you have the support from an agency, maybe there's some shared employment or I'm forgetting the term you used, Domenico, sort of like that crafted employment, but you're going to have your employer willing to do that.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about students learning to become their own advocate, where appropriate, I think it's good to actually have goals in the IEP, especially as the student is older, that they're participating more in the process, that they're learning about their disability, that they're able to say, I have autism, this noise is bothering me. So the more the student knows about his or her disability, the better able he or she is going to be able to advocate for themselves in the community, college, workplace, or whatever. So I like to see goals for a student related to their participation in an IEP as part of, especially when they're older.
Yeah, I agree. Being self-aware of your own, disability. So it helps the person, at least in my mind, it would help them understand how it affects other people's response to them. it kind of helps them feel more comfortable with themselves when they're able to, acknowledge, yes, I have a disability, this is what it is. And so be it, in a way, and we can still, I can still be successful. I can still do this. But it's not, the old days where, kids used to be made to feel ashamed or embarrassed or any of those things. Those are things of the past. At least I hope so. And I think it's important for kids to feel confident in their own abilities and their own level of disabilities, if you will.
Well, I think there's a real strength for the student in understanding where their weaknesses are. And,
Yes.
and so the strength comes from saying, okay, I'm going to this really loud situation. I have to do this 45-minute meeting. What am I going to do before to calm myself? And then what am I going to do after? So I can get through that. We all do that. We really,
Right.
I think we all do that.
Yeah.
But teaching the student how to do it is, I think, vital at any given time, but especially as they're approaching transition.
This is a really good time that we had another question come in that has to do with realistic outcomes.
Okay.
So it's in the Q&A if you want to follow along, but the question comes from an anonymous attendee and it says outcome requires assessments, right? So how would one acquire a realistic / critical assessment of a future outcome when the schools don't have a complete view or capacity to properly assess? Survey and parents are not nearly an assessment or critical assessment.
Okay.
All right. And in part, I'll defer to Domenico about what is appropriate assessment, because I'm not an expert on that. But if the school hasn't completed assessments that give you the required information, you can ask for an independent assessment. If you know what assessments you want to request, you can always request those, because you cannot develop a transition plan. You can't develop anything in an IEP without appropriate assessment. So if you don't have it, you can't develop it. So there's a process to request an independent educational evaluation, and you could end up in due process over that request. The district may or may not grant that request, but this is the critical first step. That whoever asked this question hit the nail on the head. The critical first step in developing any aspect of the IEP is, do I have the information I need to develop the plan? Now, from there, I would defer to Domenico about what sorts of assessments should we be looking for and that are appropriate. And again, I'm assuming they're going to vary student to student, because otherwise it wouldn't be individualized. But that's a fantastic question, and really is the crux of most of the issues that you'll see.
Yeah, and just to I think I understand the question. Most assessments are, what we refer to as valid and reliable tests that are done. And those are things like, if you're in the IEP, there's a present level of performance section where that information is coming from a reading assessment or a math assessment or some other form that was a valid, reliable test that was done. And we're getting that data to show where the student is at. And then again, we're writing goals and objectives to enhance the student's ability in those areas. But when it comes to things like transition, and it comes to things like, independent living skills, there is the behavioral assessment scale, which I don't know that that's necessarily a good one, but that could be used. I mean, if schools want things that are standardized or valid, I mean, there are tests that are out there that will do that, but I'm not sure that those are the best to utilize. Now, as we in the field, we've kind of introduced new ways to gather data and information that we call assessment. Now, person-centered planning, for example, has never really been considered an assessment tool, but the information we get from it is valuable enough to be considered for, to determine the assessment, to add into an assessment, component. Now, another example that has recently been deemed appropriate as an assessment tool is what we refer to as situational assessments. And those are things that are done in the community that look at an individual's ability to function in an environment. Could be work, it could be in a grocery store, it could be in any kind of situation where the student has to provide a certain expectation. Now we see the students' functional skills in those environments. Now we're doing what I call and what is called authentic assessment. They're real. We're not, asking questions. We're not asking other people to offer opinions. We're literally observing the individual conduct in this skill, and we now know whether the individual can or cannot do it. Now, if they can't do it, what that means is then that's what we have to teach. Again, in the language of special education, we refer to that as a discrepancy analysis. This is what is required in the person's performance in this environment. This is what the student or the individual is able to do in that environment, given the same expectations. And the difference between what they can do and can't do is what we refer to as a discrepancy analysis. So now, rather than saying, well, the person can't do it and walk away, no, now we say, all right, that's where we need to teach. Those are the areas that we have to enhance the skill in order for the person to be successful. Now, those kinds of authentic assessments, and those are what we call ecological inventories. I will venture to say that unless they took my course, very few really know what that means. I have written evaluations for school districts, to superintendents, to special ed directors who come back to me and ask me, what is an ecological inventory? I learned this information way back in the 1980s. And this is stuff that, to me, it's not antiquated. It's still artful. It's still progressive. So to me, those are what I refer to as authentic assessments. They may not necessarily be standardized tests. They won't be, things that are valid or reliable, but these are authentic assessments that we can use to then translate into what we need to teach, that we can then, provide that, that activities to those individual students. I trying to recall what the whole question was, and it was very complex. So, and Angela did a much better job answering it than I did, but it was a little complex for me to understand it. But what I understood, that's what I would do, or how I would approach something like that, And again, I don't know if I did answer it or not, but.
Question, Domenico, taking off from that, if it's supposed, so the ecological assessment, suppose the student is, the school has their coffee thing,
Right.
and the student's working in there. So goals and objectives and data collection could be taken about the student's performance, and that would develop, that information you're talking about would develop naturally from that program. Would that be sort of what you're talking about? Or?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, I think what happens, and I'm not, please don't get me wrong. I will be much kinder than Angela might be in saying this. I don't necessarily dislike those ideas, those coffee shop or coffee kinds of things, but there's, when we're teaching kids to do something, once they've learned it, then we need to move on to something else. But what I typically see is that they tend to stay in doing the same thing, the repetitive things over and over and over again, without any expansion of the knowledge base that might be required in maybe working in a coffee shop. I don't know if they're going to be baristas or not, but what more can we teach, and how can we expand that beyond just that little activity? And I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. I just simply think that we need to go beyond that. We need to expand the scope of instruction. And that's what I feel, and I think Angela pointed this out earlier, and that is that, we limit things. We have these canned kind of programs. We don't really, we don't go outside of those programs. It's not individualized. It's here's what we have, and you fit into this model that we've created for transition, and everybody's going to fit into that model, regardless of whether you have a different, idea, or whether you have a different expected outcome for yourself, or regardless, that's our model. So now you're having to fit into that model. And quite frankly, that's a little contrary to the adult service world that we see in today. Because when we see Medicaid waivers asking individuals to make decisions and choices about identifying what programs they want for themselves, that's more individualized than the IEP is. We're not asking them to fit in. And that's where, the old days, we used to make them go to day programs. You either fit into the day program or you didn't. Well, now they don't have to, because they can choose to do something else. And they can go to, hire someone to do whatever they want to in the community, as long as it fits in the, the criteria for the waivers. But the point being is that they're not fitting into a model. They're doing things that they feel is important to them. So I'm sorry, I did go off a little bit on that. I don't know. Angela, I don't know. If you...
No. I was going to say, if you have the waiver and if you have staffing to cover the services that you want in your waiver, I mean, those are all the ifs that I'm seeing,
Yeah.
So we're back to, I think, you pointing out, Domenico, that we have to push the envelope while we can with the school districts is critical, ever more critical than it was before.
And this is not easy. What we're talking about is not easy. It took me 45 years, and I'm still learning. And I will never say that I'm, I know people will say I'm an expert, and maybe they say that only because some judge appointed me an expert when I did in a due process hearing or whatever, but I am not an expert. There's a lot of people out there who are experts, and there's a lot of parents that are experts. There's a lot of students that are experts. They know it because they're living it. But I'm still learning, and I think I just believe that there needs to be a continuation of continuation in a process of learning that I believe sometimes teachers or professionals think that they're done, and I'm sorry, I don't want to get into a tangent here again, but
I appreciate both of your answers. I think that you both really offered a great perspective. It was about authentic and realistic assessments and outcomes. So we appreciate that answer.
Okay.
And then I just want to give you a quick warning. We're at our 30-minute marks. We're going to wrap up in about 30 minutes.
Okay, will do.
Okay. Thank you both.
Should I keep going, Angela?
Go ahead. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right. Well, students and family rights, we know that these are some of the rights, and there's more. When I started, coming up with some of this, I started listing. I said, well, no, I think this is enough. These are what students and families have the right to. They have they get the procedural safeguards, which I think they need to be much more readable and legible for parents and individuals. They have the right to participate. You have the right to receive written notice. You have the right to give consent or refusal of consent, even for placement and things like that. You have the right to receive a non-discriminatory assessment, and you have the right to receive an independent educational evaluation. So these are things that you have the right to do, or families or individual parents have the rights, which is not necessarily just a transition issue. It's an IEP issue. And there's even more that we can go into with regards to what rights people have. So in transition, again, I just wanted to make the point, an important note here, that transition is part of the IEP, not a separate document or plan. It is part of, and that's very important to remember when we conduct ourselves in these meetings. What's the school's responsibility? And Angela, you can certainly add to this. The main responsibility of school is to prepare students for post-school life, and that preparation is that individualized approach. Teaching skills that will allow them to function in post-school life, even if they're going on to college. I know I've worked with families with kids on the spectrum who are very capable individuals in terms of their ability to do academic work. But as Angela pointed out, many individuals on the spectrum lack that social skill and social ability. And what I see on campus as a professor, I see many, students, and I can tell those who are on the spectrum because they're the ones that are struggling socially. And when you struggle socially, you tend to isolate yourself, and then you don't tend to put the best foot forward, do the best for yourself because the person is seemingly isolated from their peers. So when I see that and I tell schools, then is the transition plan done? Is it complete? When you know that this individual is not going to be able to function independently or even socially, have we done our job? So they've met their academic requirements, but what about all those other requirements that make a person complete and certainly make a person feel included in society? Are we preparing them or her for that? So that's an area that is very complicated and very complex, and Angela can certainly talk more about that. But those are things that I feel schools need to have a greater responsibility for, and they're not picking up on that responsibility. They're not seeing themselves as doing or as playing that role. They simply say that the student has met their goals academically, which is great, congratulations. But yet, the student is not able to get a job because they can't meet their, the social demands, or can't go to college because they're not able to, work alongside peers, or, can't organize their time. I mean, no, we haven't done enough. We have not completed our transition plan. So I think those are things that schools need to take greater responsibility for. And of course, self-advocacy and self-determination is the other thing that they need to be teaching individual students to better do that for themselves, giving them the tools to be able to do that. I think those are things that I feel schools have a great responsibility for.
And that social communication piece is, probably the hallmark of the verbal autistic student. I always say formerly Asperger student, right? So, those Asperger kids are function socially very awkwardly, and with communication, it's very awkward. So this is where some tips for parents, you might be talking about, should your child graduate because he or she has good grades and they've fulfilled all the academic requirements, but they still haven't met goals regarding their social skills, they can still stay until they're 21. It's not going to be and you might have to tweak that a little bit more when you have an Asperger type student, because the school's going to be blinded by their grades. They have great grades, they're doing this, they're doing that, but they're going to forget that, well, he's socially awkward, or we need that community participation, so let's get him involved in track and field or whatever. It's easy for the schools to gloss that over if the grades are good. So don't, when you're considering graduation or staying, don't let a school sort of force you out the door. If you think your child needs more support in these functional areas of living, the criteria for that staying is, how have I made progress on my IEP goals? It's not whether or not I've fulfilled my graduation requirements. So I'm starting to see that more and more, this forcing out the door type thing. So, and this is where these functional self-advocacy, self-determination, social skills type pieces would really come into play, especially with that Asperger student.
Mm-hmm. And this is where I think families, the families that are out there, should be really aware of and understand this, and teachers who are out there and professionals, you're the advocates, you're the professional out there, so why not support the notion of continuation until 21 if necessary, even though a student has met their academic goals. This is not, the important thing is that when our students leave our schools, they're going to be in our communities. And if they're not going to be able to function, adequately in our communities, it's a reflection on us as an educational system, first of all, but they're also going to add to the burden of society, if you will. And I know that's a harsh way of saying it, but they're going to be asking for public assistance, or they're going to be asking for services that if we had done a proper, if you will, job in our educational system, maybe that would not necessarily have to occur. So we have to really acknowledge that our efforts need to be upped more than they have been, because we want better outcomes for our students. Parents' responsibility. How about parents, family, and student responsibility? What is it? And how do you foster a results-oriented outcome? So first of all, I think it's important to know your rights. And there's many different ways. I mean, when I think about, myself and think about when I was in college, many years ago, and going through my doctoral program, and I think about how I had to go do a literature review and a literature search. I used to have to go to the card catalog. You remember that, Angela?
Oh yeah, typewriters.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all of that stuff. I mean, today you can get things on your fingertips, on your phone. It's there. So if you want to know what your rights are, they're there. And it's in simple language. There are groups like the PEAC, Pennsylvania Education for All Coalition, or the Peel Center, which is out in Pittsburgh. Those are groups and organizations that are run by parents who provide information in language that is clear and understandable. So there are resources out there for families and parents. So, I'd encourage you to look for those. Know your rights. Begin the process early. In Pennsylvania, the process must begin as early as 14. The federal requirements say 16. Well, in Pennsylvania, it's as early as 14, which is great. Again, prepare a vision, a post-school outcome. Your vision statement, have it there, present it to everyone, let everyone know that this is where what you are there for. You're there to talk about this outcome statement. Decide on a post-school direction. What is it going to be? Is it going to be college, work? I mean, what is it that we're preparing for? And ensure that the goals are aligned with those outcome statements. And I'm going to show you a diagram in a moment that Dan Steer and I wrote an article on that we published a few years back that shows this is the way it should be. And Dan and I were quite surprised that we got it published, because we thought, boy, this is very simple, isn't it? Why is it such a such an interesting diagram when to us it's just common sense. But ensure that the goals align with the outcome statement. And then finally, parents, I know it's not easy, but you have to monitor the activities. You have to constantly monitor what's going on at school and the plan. You have to ask questions. You have to be on top of things. And if you have to be the squeaky wheel, you'll get the oil, as they say, right? If you have to be that person, you'll get the results. You'll get, what you're expected. But it's those, situations where we don't, and we just let things lie, then we will just get what we get. And that's not what oftentimes is best. Angela, do you have any other?
Yeah, a couple things for the parents. I have a lot of parents tell me, they never told me this, and I'm just overwhelmed because, you're dealing with medical and behavioral health and mental health. So yes, the school should be explaining all of these things to you. I can assure you they will not. So that the procedural safeguards, which is really in legalese. So, unless you're a lawyer or a psychologist, you're going to have a hard time understanding these documents, or a PhD, or, an educator. an advanced educator. I sometimes wonder if some of the younger educators really understand the full scope. So there's no shame in I don't understand this thing, because frankly, when I started, I didn't. I didn't understand it at all, and I was a lawyer. So bring someone with you, attend conferences, make sure that it's in your language. So the people who are bilingual, but they're Spanish speakers, but their English is good but not fantastic, ask to have the document translated. These are complicated documents. Have it in your own language. The creativity involved, you might want to make an agenda. Here's the things I want to cover. So, and again, bring someone with you. You can bring anyone with you to support you. You can bring your sister to take notes while you sit there, someone to make you feel comfortable. So those are all things with know your rights. This is a critical slide. One of the things that when I was preparing for tonight, some of the documents, some of the handouts are great. In fact, I found one from Disability Rights on transition to adulthood that's actually written for the student. So it's addressed to the student. And I thought it was, a lot of and Domenico Sills is mentioned in this document.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah, Sills and Project Search
Okay.
are mentioned. So, there's, and if I was a teacher, I'd probably pull this off and go over this with all my students who were capable of understanding it, because it's a little complicated, but there's some good stuff in here. So there is a lot out there. And there's places like the ARC that are, and Disability Rights of PA and the Ed Law Center. It's all designed to hopefully translate it out of legalese into something that a parent can understand.
So when I say align with the outcomes, this is kind of what I'm talking about. And this is a diagram that, as I mentioned, Dan Steer and I created and published in the Council for Exceptional Children several years ago. But again, we start with the post-school outcomes right here. So this is what we do. We create a post-school outcome. From there, we take a look at the present levels of performance. Based on what the post-school outcomes are, the present levels of performance will help us to determine what we need to teach in order to get to this point. So the present levels tells us what the baseline is, if you will, where the student is at in achieving, in getting closer to those post-school outcomes. From there, we create a statement of transition needs, and that's where we determine the need for transition. That leads us to annual goals and objectives. So again, it's a very simple diagram as far as I'm concerned, but it starts with the post-school outcomes, going into understanding what the baseline of skill set is for that student. Under that, we put those in a transition statement that leads us to the goals and objectives. Now, if this was the post-school outcome was, going on to college, well, then all of this would be, okay, the present levels is going to be all academic stuff. And then the academic, those academics would lead us to, understanding that what we need is goals that are going to improve on that student's academic levels to meet the goal of going on to college. So you can see how this becomes a linear idea. This is a linear approach to the process of the IEP and to the transition plan. To maybe see it a little bit more involved, again, the outcome, there could be several annual goals, and then under those annual goals, we might have several objectives. So that let's take, for example, living in an apartment would be the outcome. Learning to cook, learning to clean are two goals, and objectives under learning to cook would be using a microwave, reading a recipe. Learning to clean, we could be using a vacuum or learning to dust. These are just examples as to how we would look at the outcome and then going into the goal that lead us into the objectives, right? So again, this is the kind of stuff that we don't see a lot of in transition or in IEPs, because I just don't believe that there's a clear understanding of these kinds of important and simple, in my mind, very simple, expectations. We just don't see enough of this that lead us to those kind of outcomes.
And Domenico, if I can, what I really liked about these charts is you could almost, do this Venn diagram rubric to help understand how a goal goes. Goal is to read at a 3rd grade level. Okay,
Right.
how am I going to do it? And it can be broken down into just about anything, or even this live in an apartment. Then the goals would be, well, first of all, can we read? Do we need to work on that? And do we need to learn math? So I think all of this, if you are having problems with conceptualizing what a goal is going to look like, this type of rubric I'd suggest to parents could be helpful to you.
Yeah, and we'll make these slides available to you, Cody, because I think it might be useful. Again, this is just, this is what it would look like. Here's something that would be in practical use. But again, I think these lend themselves to that. So the elements of transition, description of the future, service activities aligning to the student's vision and reflective of the student's needs. Again, all of those things that, the outcomes here are reflective of what the student's interest is. So this individual student, let's assume they're saying that they want to live in an apartment. Well, that's fine. So now we have to assess the person's skills in living in an apartment. And then that's how we come up with the goals and objectives and things like that. But that is reflective of the student's interest and strengths and needs. So everything is very, very consistent and linear with regards to how we look at this. So here's an example of, here's a couple of examples of post-school outcome statements. And I see a lot of these, and Angela probably does too. I'm sure she does, where, we see these goals and you read them and say, well, how is this an outcome-oriented statement? How is this, how does this make sense even? It has nothing to do with, what the student is trying to achieve here. But I just come up with a few possible, and these are not perfect either, but these are, from my perspective, closer to what we would want to see in an IEP goal or an IEP than otherwise. So if the student is going to post-secondary education, Sally is expected to be gainfully employed in a job of her choice that will fit her interest and capabilities. It is expected that she will need training in a post-secondary education program to learn the necessary skills. So we're not holding ourselves to anything real specific, but we are saying that we're preparing her for a job that she has yet to identify that fits her interests and capabilities, but also that she will need more training, and that will come from post-secondary education. So, I think schools sometimes are very fearful about being too specific, because if they're too specific, then they're caught into, well, that didn't happen, so now you're accountable and responsible for making that happen. And that's where the compensatory education parts come in. But we can do better. We can do better at both. We can make better outcome statements, and we can achieve better results with those outcome statements that will lead us to a better outcome overall, and not have to deal with, compensatory ed or any of those other things. If it's employment, Sally is expected to be competitively employed. And again, this is an important operative word: competitive employment, not sheltered, not, supported, or it could be supported employment, but it's a competitive job within a job and career path that is based on her interest and preference. So this could be something for a 16-year-old, because maybe we haven't really identified their interest and preferences yet. So it requires a little bit more exploration. So by making a statement of this nature, what we're going to say is that part of our goals are going to be doing some career exploration. Maybe we'll do some work-based experience trainings and provide, get feedback that way. Any of these kinds of things are going to be that are functional and that are, important and related to this particular goal. She'll be trained and instructed in areas that she needs to be gainfully employed in a job that will match her skills, her wages that are commensurate to the job market and will be adequate for independent living. Again, we're making it very, very clear, very specific. I shouldn't say very specific, but making it very clear what it is that we're preparing Sally for. If it's independent living, it's again very similar. Sally's expected to live independently with or without assistance commensurate to her level of need in a supportive living environment. So we don't know, necessarily at this point yet how independent Sally might be. So, if we use terminology like independent, commensurate to the level of her need. Now we know that she may need some support. We may not necessarily know exactly how much support, but we know that she may need some support. So this kind of language helps to, create a situation where we're looking at things broadly enough, but yet we're meeting the outcomes of what an individual might need. So, she'll be able to access community resources, medical and psychiatric and public transport. So again, we're getting into more detail as to what we are going to prepare her for. So if we do this early on, and let's say at the age of 14, then what we can do is that all leads us into a process, so it's not a one-year deal. So if we create these kinds of goals as early as 14, well, in 2 years, that goal might change to be a little bit more specific, because now we may be identified what apartment or what roommates, or we might know that what job Sally might want, and all of those things. And then we begin to be more specific. But again, remember, we feel that this is a process that we begin at a point, and it's scaffolding. Those educators who remember, the scaffolding of skills that we do with our students, we're scaffolding those skills to meet the needs of the individual until we reach the outcomes that we're there to achieve. So these are things that are that we need to identify as early as possible, so we can, make those scaffolding or that process more achievable for our students. Angela, I don't know if you have any.
No, and what's really great about these slides for you parents is you see the pieces of the IEP coming in here, so that the IEP itself is the map towards transition. You see instruction. Wow, what does that look like? We talked about goals and objectives, related services. So all these pieces are now the things, the parts of the IEP. So if you're using your long-term goal as that outcome statement from transition, you can develop those pieces. And then you're looking at present levels. Well, the present levels are going to tell you what you need to do to get there. You develop the goals from that, and if done well, it would go together. Now, biggest word of caution is the lack of time spent on transition. And I myself am as guilty of that as anybody, because invariably you're going into the IEP meeting. If I'm there, it's usually a little more contentious, and there's an urgent issue. And you spend time on the urgent issue, but you never get back to the transition. So particularly if you're in an annual IEP meeting, or your things at school are somewhat calm, the focus on the transition, and then the rest flows from it, which I think this, Domenico, your slides really show that so clearly, how it flows together.
And I know we only have like 7 minutes left. I'm keeping track of our time, so I'm just going to, because you will be getting these slides, and a lot of these things are pretty self-explanatory. But Angela and I, when we got together, we had talked about, perhaps discussing what are some of the challenges that schools currently face. Angela, maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about these challenges that, and although they're challenges, they're not excuses. They're just that they are challenges. So, yeah.
And so the big theme throughout this year, and this year has been the worst of the 3 years since the pandemic, and unbelievably so. You thought this year would start to get better. Well, it's worse. You know, there excuses are made. Well, we can't staff this, or this is what we have, and and again, staffing is driving all of this. So we had to consolidate these classes because there's not enough staffing, financial problems, and none of this is excused. The IDEA was never, ever suspended during the entire pandemic. So early on, the hearing officers kind of did the, oh, poor school district thing. But now it's been, you know, we're now 3 years out from the closure. I'm hoping that they're over that. And so what are you going to do when you're stuck with, you couldn't go out, the kids who couldn't go out to work experiences because either there wasn't enough staff or the restaurant was closed, whatever. So these are all driving, these are all very concrete problems that we're trying to overcome. I don't think they've been overcome well. And I think we're going to have to rethink everything. You know, we can no longer sit in an IEP meeting and accept we don't have the staff. It's not possible. Comp ed alone, all the comp ed, I always say all the comp ed in the world is not going to replace an appropriate program right now. How are you going to make up 2 years of educational loss because there wasn't staffing? How do you make that up? I don't think you can. So where are we going to get rid of the sides, you know, parent side, school side, and all just talk about the student? But these have been, these issues that we brought up, Domenico and I talked about, are what I'm dealing with every single day. And finally, actually, it was my son who said to me, when are we going to stop accepting that we don't have staff as a reason not to provide the service? What can we do differently in order to service families who need these supports? And so to those who are educators, I ask you to think about that in a creative way. To those who are parents, we're going to have to problem solve and come up with our own solutions and take those to the school district. But it's horrible out there. It really is. And the families that are getting hit the hardest are those with autism and developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities. The children who need the most do not have the paraprofessional support and the additional support. Behavioral health services are gutted because there's nobody who's working one-to-one with the students. So families are getting hit by on both ends, the behavioral end, and the 3 ends, the medical end and the school end. When are we going to look at this differently? And that's particularly important in terms of transition. How are we going to make up those lost experiences that someone who's turning 21 this school year missed 3 years of experience because businesses were closed and there's not enough staffing? I don't know how to overcome that. But again, parents, it's an individualized education plan. You have the power, using the word individualized, to try to really make a difference for your student. I don't know, Domenico, if you want to add to that. There wasn't.
No, the only thing that I would mention is that from my perspective, again, I think Angela sees a lot of this because it's you know, it's very much a legal issue. I mean, these are and again, I don't want to say necessarily excuses. I mean, these are the realities, but they can't be used as excuses for ineffective programs for kids. But you know, what I see is that we don't have a lot of evidence-based practices out there, and I just don't, you know, and we have a lot of examples. You know, I mean, I wrote a book, you know, with Dan Steer and Ernie Rose. We collaborated on a book on transition, and in that we provide an incredible number of examples of best practices in transition. And I just, you know, I don't understand with all the different, researches, the research that's out there and all the different literature that's been published on good practices for transition, why we don't see more of it, and why it's still lacking. And we simply see poor quality services. And that is not acceptable. Our whole educational system is based on best practice, but we're not seeing it, particularly there. I know we're out of time, but the pandemic affected our educational system in so many ways. Online instruction and education, our children, our students, fell sorely behind because of that. Social emotional development, we know the effects of that isolation on our students today in all areas of social emotional development. No inclusion. I mean, God, inclusion is so important, connecting with people, and it wasn't there, and just simply not being able to learn in the context of real situations. And if we're talking about transition, you have to learn these things in real life experiences in real contextual ways. And that was completely lost during that period of time. So we know that the pandemic affected our services and educational system pretty drastically, but these are just some of the things that I feel have really affected our kids. So I'm going to stop there because the rest is pretty self-explanatory. And any final thoughts that I might have kind of go into including students and families or active participants. You need to be creative and you need to have commitment. And I always say real choices come from real experiences, including work experiences. So if you really want to see kids developing good decision-making abilities and making choices about things, they have to have real experiences to be able to make those choices. They just can't make them from the top of their head or just by seeing pictures. They have to experience them. And we have to provide those experiences in order for people to make real choices. And student choices are at the heart of the transition process. They have to be part of it and they have to be that involved. Okay. Well, I know we're out of time, so we'll make these slides available to you, Cody.
Yes, thank you.
And then you can pass them along. But please remember, these are protected. These are slides that are my slides and Angela's slides, and these are not to be used without permission. So please make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay.
I'll send it in a PDF as well. So
perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Cody, do you want to? I was going to say stop the recording to see if anybody has any last minute questions.
That is what I was going to do. So I do want to thank you so much for presenting on this very informative webinar. It was definitely insightful. I definitely learned even more information. You always have some good tips there, Dr. C, and Angela, you had some good legal advice on that too. So thank you for that.